The legal world can feel like this big, confusing maze of complex rules and jargon. But what if we could break it all down for you in just a few minutes? Well, today, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're demystifying the Massachusetts criminal law system and turning all that intricate legal speak into a super straightforward guide. So let's start with a question I bet a lot of you have wondered about. What is the actual difference between a felony and a misdemeanor? Is it just about how serious the crime is, or is there something more to it? The answer is absolutely fundamental to how the entire system works, and we're about to make it crystal clear. All right, here's our game plan. First, we'll cover the basic rules of the system. Then, we'll tackle that big felony versus misdemeanor question. After that, we'll look at the recipe for a crime, follow a case through the courts, see what happens after a verdict, and finally, we'll wrap up with the rights that protect people and offer second chances. Okay, first things first. Before we get into the details, we have to understand the foundation. See, criminal law isn't just some random list of do's and don'ts. It's a highly structured system, and everything in it has a purpose. So, at its heart, Massachusetts criminal law is basically the state's official playbook for justice. It lays out exactly what counts as a crime, the step-by-step process for how someone is prosecuted, and what the punishments can be. It's all written down in the Massachusetts general laws, and the whole thing is built on two huge ideas: accountability and fairness. All right, let's circle back to that big question about felonies and misdemeanors. The law basically sorts all crimes into these two buckets. And honestly, once you get this difference, everything else kind of clicks into place. And here is the single biggest difference. It's not just about how serious the crime is. It really comes down to the potential sentence. For a felony, you're talking about more than a year in state prison. For a misdemeanor, it's typically less than a year served in a county jail. The amount of time and the place you serve it, those are the defining factors. And this really puts it all into perspective, right? On the one hand, you have felonies. We're talking really serious stuff like robbery or drug trafficking with sentences that can last for decades, even life. And then you have misdemeanors, like a simple assault or trespassing. The consequences are still serious, for sure, jail time, fines, but legally, they're on a completely different level. So what does the state actually have to prove to convict someone of a crime? Well, think of it like a recipe with two essential ingredients. The prosecution has to prove both of them are there, without a doubt. The first ingredient is something called actus reus, which is just a fancy Latin way of saying the guilty act. This is the physical part. It means a person had to actually do something the law forbids, or in some cases, it could be failing to do something they were legally required to do. And ingredient number two is mens rea, or the guilty mind. This is the mental part. See, it's not enough to just do the act. The prosecution also has to prove the person had a certain mindset, that they did it intentionally or knowingly, or at the very least recklessly. So here's the bottom line. You gotta have both. An act without the guilty mind isn't a crime, and a guilty mind without the act isn't a crime either. The prosecution's entire case depends on proving that specific combination. Okay, so once an arrest happens, the case begins this whole journey through the court system. Let's walk through the typical path a case takes here in Massachusetts. So it all kicks off with an arrest, which has to be based on probable cause. That's a reasonable belief that a crime happened. Soon after, the person makes their first appearance in court where the charges are read. Then comes the pretrial phase, which is a super important time for lawyers to exchange evidence and negotiate possible plea deals. If no deal is made, the case heads to trial, which is usually in district court for misdemeanors and superior court for more serious felonies. But hey, the story doesn't end with a guilty verdict. What happens next is a really critical phase, focused on punishment, but also, and this is important, on rehabilitation. A judge has a bunch of different options, a few tools in their toolkit, if you will. A sentence could mean incarceration, that's jail or prison, or it could be supervised probation out in the community. It might also involve fines or maybe participation in treatment programs. And this part is really interesting because it shows a progressive side of the Massachusetts system, a real focus on rehabilitation. The state has created these special courts, like drug courts and mental health courts, that are designed to tackle the root causes of criminal behavior. The whole idea here is to focus on treatment and recovery, not just punishment. Okay, last section. And this is a big one, because this whole system isn't just about prosecution and punishment. It's also built on a foundation of fundamental rights for the individual and, sometimes, the chance for a fresh start.
Woven into the very fabric of this whole process are some really important constitutional rights that protect every single person accused of a crime. And these aren't just suggestions, they're powerful safeguards, like the right to remain silent or the right to have a lawyer. They exist to make sure the scales of justice stay balanced.
And for people who have served their time, Massachusetts offers two key ways to get a second chance. Think of expungement as completely deleting the file. For some minor offenses, the record is just gone, like it never happened. Record sealing is more like putting that file in a locked cabinet. The record is still there, but it's hidden from the public, which, as you can imagine, is a huge deal when you're trying to get a job or find a place to live.
And all of this brings us to one final thought. The criminal legal system is this incredibly complex dance between strict rules and real human beings. And it's constantly forcing us to ask a really tough question. How do we hold people accountable for what they've done while also creating a real path for them to rebuild their lives? There's no easy answer, but that's really the central challenge of modern justice.